Donc, passons à un autre sujet d'intérêt, sécuriser la chaîne d'approvisionnement énergétique, atténuer les risques et surmonter les contraintes. Alors, je suis ravi d'accueillir avec nous notre modérateur invité, qui est un habitué de nos événements, Marc Jacquard. En septembre 2023, Marc a été nommé président et directeur général de la Commission des services publics de la Colombie-Britannique, poste qu'il avait déjà occupé de 1992 à 1997. Actuellement, il est en congé de son poste de professeur distingué à l'Université Simon Fraser. On est toujours reconnaissant lorsque Marc accepte de participer à nos événements, surtout compte tenu de son emploi du temps chargé. Donc, veuillez vous joindre à moi pour accueillir Marc pour cette prochaine session.
Merci, Edouard. And thank you for inviting me today. I wanted to just say one thing, and I hope everyone's come back by now, because that was, as a longtime modeler, energy economy modeler in Canada, that was a lot of fun to watch, that last session. And congrats to Mo and everyone who helped make that happen. I was a modeler here when there was really only two of us, and we could be in a phone booth for our meetings. It was me and Richard Leloup, and maybe someone named Campbell Watkins, who would do some modeling for the National Energy Board and a few other things, and ended up being a mentor of mine. So it's really wonderful to see it spread out like this. Also, for a very long time, I and some of the other people here have been doing modeling. Oh, and Nick Macaluso, if he's still here, was there way back when as well, but have been doing modeling with the Energy Modeling Forum based out of Stanford University. But it brings together modelers, mostly Americans, but also they're open to all of their modeling groups. And you just get this fantastic experience for modelers, first of all, to be around people that are as interested in what you do as you are, which is pretty rare, right? You don't bring this up at parties, I hope. And to be able to really exchange ideas like that. And so my congratulations to the Energy Modeling Hub for organizing this. And this is really starting to show the great value of what you provide. So congrats to all of those involved in that. So our session today may sound a little bit eclectic. We have three speakers, and I'm going to ask them to give their remarks in the order in which you see them listed there. They've got about 15 minutes each, and then we're going to take the questions at the end of the whole process, so I'll get them to be up here after that. Or no, I'm actually going to ask them to come up, all of them right now. So that's Mark Winfield from York University, who will be our first speaker, and Abdul Rahman Ayad, there, okay, and so come on up and take a seat, and Francis Bradley from Electricity Canada, and he and I were just laughing because we were just on a panel together a few weeks ago. We've got to stop meeting like this. So our topic is energy supply chain, mitigating risks and overcoming constraints, and I welcome you to join me and have some fun in this diversity of topics and the discussion that will follow. So Mark, come on up if you want to get us started. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Great, thanks, Mark. It's good to see everybody here and make new friends and see some old ones as well. I'm assuming this is the clicker, so we'll see how this goes. So I'm going to approach this question around supply chains and energy transitions with a mixture of normative and practical, because, let's see if this works. Very good. Because the supply chain question kind of reminds us that we need to be taking into account life cycle perspectives when thinking about technological options and pathways to decarbonization. We need to be looking at the upstream and downstream consequences of the choices that we make. And this can have some quite significant implications for decarbonization. Some of the things may look low carbon at the point of final conversion or delivered energy, but actually hide significant upstream GHG emissions that may obviate the apparent gains in terms of overall emissions. And we've got a number of examples of this. There's longstanding conversations around biofuels and the need to take very careful life cycle perspectives on energy and carbon balance. Similar questions are emerging around hydrogen, particularly obviously the brown and gray dimensions of the spectrum, but the blue and the red as well. terms of where do they leave us overall. There are other examples that are less well assessed, but may be very significant. One of the things that's been discussed a lot is critical minerals and the possibility of some major expansion of mining operations in the Boreal region, the Hudson's Bay, James Bay lowlands, and that could have very significant implications for the region's status and functions as a global-scale carbon sequestration and storage site. I was actually co-director on an ecological services valuation on the Boreal. That was a few years ago now. But there's the carbon dimension, which was quite surprising at that stage, just how significant it was. And it's in the peat. It's not in the trees. But then, of course, there's also biodiversity implications, which, of course, the second sort of global biospheric crisis that we're facing. And then in the Boreal, there is also the question of implications for reconciliation with the indigenous peoples who live in that region. In approaching this question, we began to think about this. It leads into some wider questions about sustainability and the pathways that we choose. And when we were approaching this question for the purpose of our book here we published with UBC Press last month, a number of EMH people, including Mark, our contributors to the chapters in the book, we began conceiving of this relationship between electrification and energy systems integration in the way we're showing here, that is seeing electrification, which is, we're just heard, gets overwhelming sort of focus of the conversation, may be best understood as a subset of energy systems integration, which incorporates a wider range of carriers, infrastructures. Crucially, and I'll come back to this later, also incorporates considerations about what happens on the demand side. We've had an overwhelming focus, it seems, on the supply side, but energy systems integration itself is best seen as then a subcategory of this concept of decarbonization, which has to encompass energy, but also has to cover things like agriculture, forestry, land use, and waste management. And then that itself, decarbonization, can be seen as a subset of this larger category of sustainability. It's sort of a necessary but not sufficient consideration in advancing sustainability. In approaching this, for our purposes within the volume, we approached energy sustainability in terms of 9 principles, which are going to be far too small to see here, but were the product of fairly extensive literature review, discussions among the contributors, including, and this is a range from people who are in this room who are doing mathematical modeling to indigenous practitioners in remote Dene and Inuit communities in the far north who pointed us in direction. It's a very interesting work there in terms of thinking about sustainability. And the crucial implication here is that, and the SDGs are probably in here as well, a number of different literatures, we need to be thinking about transitions and pathways in terms of how do we advance sustainability overall, or on the other side of it, how do we recognize and avoid trade-offs among sustainability goals to the greatest extent that we can. Sometimes this is being described as a need to avoid carbon tunnel vision in thinking about transitional pathways, the need to pay attention to upstream and downstream dimensions of these issues and to non-carbon impacts and consequences. Turning more specifically to supply chains, the material dimensions of decarbonization have been getting a lot of attention lately, although this has been a little bit of an afterthought, although it is an area where the risk of negative trade-offs is actually very, very high. The material flows required around decarbonization are really only beginning to be modeled and understood. I must admit, our own research group, Sustainable Energy Initiative at York, kind of stumbled into this mostly out of work that we were doing through an NSERC research network on energy storage. And we're actually working mostly on regulatory frameworks for what we now call distributed energy resources. But that led into conversations about second lives for EV batteries, and which then led into, oops, there we go, I'm behind on my slides already, led us into conversations about, well, what happens at the end of life? And we began asking questions about this. And unfortunately, we failed for the most part to record the sound of the crickets on the other end of phones as we phoned around agencies at the federal, state, provincial levels around North America. What we found essentially was a complete blank in terms of any kind of regulatory framework or indeed any meaningful publicly available information about what was actually happening to batteries end of life. And keeping in mind that the EV adoption curves also translate into a downstream flow of tens of millions of end-of-life EV batteries. This is an area where circularity could play a very significant role in securing supply chains and reducing pressures for the expansion of primary extractive activities. But as I say, what we found in North America's policy framework is essentially non-existent. The Europeans are way ahead of us on this. There was actually a European Union regulation adopted this June, which focuses specifically on end-of-life batteries with a very strong emphasis on extended producer responsibility. Circularity introduces the concept of battery passports to basically facilitate chain of custody tracking, and places a strong emphasis on, well, it begins to move in the direction of even recycled content requirements. Thinking about this more broadly, well, what does all this mean for modelers, and what does it mean for policymakers? For modelers, the challenge here is that much of our existing modeling about the transition has tended, I think, somewhat inadvertently to embody a lot of carbon tunnel vision, and that's partially a function because that's what the modelers have been asked to look at, is to look at this in terms of the carbon impacts and to some degree costs as sort of the key outcomes. And we just saw that in terms of what we just saw go by. Even in carbon terms, though, our modeling tools may not be necessarily that well equipped to handle the up and downstream implications of supply chains and fuel cycles. Our ability to identify and assess and integrate non-carbon dimensions of these questions are, I think, could be reasonably described as underdeveloped. Probably the strongest around criteria air pollutants, function of work, the California Air Resources Board and all kinds of other actors like that, get a lot weaker when it comes to conversations about the downstream waste streams associated with non-renewable fuel cycles and the upstream dimensions of that as well. Landscape impacts occasionally come into these conversations, but sometimes in very strange ways. There has been a tendency I've seen to focus on the fence line footprint of final conversion facilities. And if you're thinking about things like nuclear or coal or fracked gas, that's a fairly significant oversight in terms of where the most significant landscape impacts may be happening, which is largely upstream. I think we still struggle to deal with questions of compatibility with other land uses, particularly around renewables. I often see them treated as sort of an exclusive land use, which in my mind doesn't make a lot of sense. I come from a university with an awful lot of flat roof, and therefore a lot of solar potential. But you know, wind turbines are things easily compatible with agricultural land uses. So that's the modeling side. The policy side is more complicated. And again, I think we were just seeing hints of this. I think a crucial one is to recognize the levels of uncertainty that we're dealing with here and the scale of the risks that we're talking about. And I would emphasize potentially the risks around overbuild as well. But there are uncertainties in multiple dimensions. I think we're struggling to figure out how do we deal with this. There are technological uncertainties. I've argued in other places we're in the midst of not one but three technological revolutions around energy storage, renewables, and grid integration, which are potentially synergistic and mutually supporting. We're not necessarily capturing that well, but it has implications in terms of what do future pathways look like. I think we heard the question of demand side raised, and I think there's an awful lot of questions there in terms of what happens both is the potential on the demand side in terms of efficiency, demand side measures, demand response, but also lots of questions about how much of the growth in electricity demand is necessarily going to materialize or needs to materialize as bulk grid demand that needs to be served by large centralized infrastructure projects. And we are also operating in an environment of very, very high political risk. The federal provincial consensus around climate change that existed in 2016 or 2018 has completely collapsed. And that is translating into political risk at the federal level, and there are no obvious provincial champions, with the possible exception of BC, who might take up the mantle of climate policy leadership if there were to be a change of government at the federal level. We need also to pay attention to the pathways to both recognize potential risks and trade-offs and their significance. I was struck, at least the thought that was going through my mind, the previous presentations, there's a lot of heroic assumptions being made here about SMRs and CCUS that we may want to think about a little bit more, at least recognize as an area of risk. We need to be paying attention to pathways that minimize adverse trade-offs among sustainability goals. Among other things, this means a need to focus on energy productivity over energy production. And again, this was striking in the conversation about the CER modeling, is we had almost nothing said about what might happen on the demand side, both in terms of active CDM measures, but also how consumers may respond. We got a little bit of hint of that you could see some industrial consumption move behind the fence, particularly where there's cogeneration opportunities, for example. If we're going to add capacity, we probably want to do that in smaller scale increments rather than large centralized resources. I would argue that tends to distribute and mitigate economic, technological, environmental, and social risks. Our little piece of work on the end-of-life EV batteries was kind of a reminder to be thinking about circularity in the material realm. And as we sort of saw as we did our tour of agencies asking, well, have you started to think about what happens with EOL EV batteries? And we're greeted with a wall of silence. And indeed, in one case, we're actually greeted with an official statement that we intend to do absolutely nothing. Surprising, not surprising, that was Ontario. That was the official answer that we got on the record. In realms like transportation, we need to be thinking about urban design, we need to be thinking about transportation demand management over simple replacement of ICE fleets with EVs. And I'm going to end there because my time is almost done, so I will say thank you, merci, miigwech, and we'll welcome your questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Right on time. Okay, our next speaker is Abdulram Ayad from McGill. Please join me in welcoming.
Right, hi everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. It's always tricky to present so close to lunch, but thank you for. All right, so my name is Abdul Rahman Ayad. I'm a PhD student at McGill University with Professor Francois Bouffard. My main area of research is transmission planning and power systems planning in general. But today I'll be trying to link that with the securing the energy supply chain. And I think there are a lot of lessons learned between the power system planning and securing the supply chain in terms of investment that we need to make and how the systems will evolve and essentially what challenges are currently facing. So to give a quick overview of my presentation today, so I'll just begin by talking about the context of the energy supply chain in Canada and how is that being affected by the disruptions or the general supply chain overall in the world. And then we'll talk about what kind of strategies can we adopt to actually mitigate some of the vulnerabilities and risk associated with the new advancement in the supply chain and the transition to net zero economy. And then I'll just introduce my model framework that we're developing to power system planning and how can that add some flexibility, essentially a strategic flexibility in terms of planning in order to reduce these risks. And I'll introduce a simple case study of transmission planning with storage planning as well. So, okay. Yeah, here we go. Okay. So the future energy scenarios in Canada and overall world are characterized by being very uncertain, and there's a lot of uncertainties in what can happen. And essentially, as a famous statistician said, all models are wrong, but some are useful. So here we're just showing three of the main scenarios developed by the Canada Energy Regulator, showing the global net zero, Canada net zero, and current measures. And the difference between the first two is essentially the pace at which the world is taking actions to reduce the emissions, and how the effects on Canada as a trader country that actually influenced and affected by how the world is moving towards the net zero emissions. And we can see there's a lot of differences and shapes that we can go from the current measures all the way to the net zero scenarios in terms of how the electricity will play a bigger role, what role will play the new technologies such as hydrogen, carbon capture, utilization and storage, and bioenergy. So essentially, depending on how the future will unfold, then the system will be very different from today. So this shift in paradigm is focusing on the transition from fossil fuels to clean energy technologies. And you can see here in the recent report from IEA is how the market size will shift essentially from oil to clean tech by 2050 throughout the years. So you'll see what's really interesting here is that a lot of components into this clean energy scenario. So you have the fuel cell, solar PV, wind. So essentially, instead of focusing on one major element, which is the fossil fuels and oil, we just transition to a more diversified portfolio. So this new transition will bring new opportunities, but at the same time will have new vulnerabilities because we're adding more complexities, we're adding more layers in terms of the extraction, transport, and operation of these new components needed for the transition of the net zero economy. But at the same time, we have the simultaneity of the energy transition, is that every country all over the world are trying to make the same transition at the same time, but we have limited resources, so that can make a lot of challenges in terms of how to ensure all of the supply chain is sustainable, secure, and resilient. So the security of the supply chain refers to being uninterrupted supply at a stable prices, so essentially how to ensure that throughout the next 20 or 30 years, we'll have uninterrupted supplies of the critical materials and components that we need, and resilient response to disruption. So as we know, the future is uncertain, major events will happen, the pandemic, the supply chain crisis in Europe. So all of that may happen again in the future. So we need to ensure that we build a resilient supply chain to respond to this disruption as much as possible. So as you all know, the role of critical minerals such as copper, lithium, nickel are very important, but essentially how important they are depends on how likely it is they have a disruption in the supply chain and what is the impact of that disruption on the overall energy supply chain. So essentially, not all disruptions are created equal. Essentially, we have some important components such as lithium, cobalt. All of these will impact the supply chain in a high manner because they're concentrated in terms of market, in terms of bottlenecks that can cut all of these supply. So far I'm just introducing the challenges, but how actually to secure this supply chain and how to improve how we plan it. So the IEA recently released a report securing clean energy technologies, and they proposed 5 pillars in order to assure that we move on with a secure, resilient, and uninterrupted supply chain. Essentially, there are five of them. So the first one is diversify as much as possible. This is necessary in order to ensure we're not at risk of one specific type of disruption. Invest. So the amount investment needed is going to be significantly higher in order to reach the stated targets. Innovation is the key, and I think we can all agree that there are a lot of promising technologies, but they're not all market ready yet. So the goal is to actually bring these technologies to scale in order to reach targets. So how much we can innovate will actually be a risk hedge against any disruption of the supply chain. Collaboration, essentially between different government levels, the private sector and public sector, as well as internationally, is a key in ensuring that the supply chain of energy is undisrupted. And acceleration, of course, we need to accelerate the adoption of these technologies to reach targets by the stated policies. So these are the main pillars, but the real question is how to implement these strategies in energy system modeling. All of these policies, how to bring the technicalities into the modeling itself. So we we began our research by assessing how uncertainty is being dealt with in engineering systems in general. And there are two main approaches, essentially building a robust system which is able to handle uncertainty. Essentially, you're planning for the worst case scenario without the need to change the system. So your system is robust enough to handle all of these uncertainties and disruptions. The second option is actually to design for flexibility. And designing for flexibility here, we mean that the system is able to adapt and change as needed if there is a need in terms of as uncertainty is unfolded. So depending on the scenario that happens, we'll have a flexible system that can able to change accordingly. And we can see here how the system elements in any given system is partitioned into an areas where there's an opportunity to improve the flexibility. So I'll just be focusing on the lower right corner here, where we see the flexibility are the elements that have a high degree risk of impacting from a possible changed upstream. So essentially, we need to emphasize the flexible systems elements in these area in order to ensure they don't affect all the remaining subsystems components. So one way to think about flexibility is that you have operational flexibility and long-term or capacity flexibility. And the argument can be made is that the strategic one is definitely more challenging. You lock in a lot of investments, it's high capital intensive, it's a long-term project. So essentially, how to recognize the uncertainty in long-term project is definitely more challenging. So one modeling technique that we use is the options or real options, which is borrowed from the financial sector. Essentially, the financial options give you the right, but not the obligation to buy or sell or trade any given stock asset. Real options, on the other hand, focus on the technical component of the system. So it gives you the right, but not the obligation to change the system in the face of uncertainty. So again, this is going back to the flexibility definition and how to implement it in technical system modeling perspective. So thinking about the types of options, I will not go in detail of all of them, but essentially the three main types, deferral options, zoom option, and switching options will give the system the ability to change or expand or change technology or change the product itself and the resources in order to mitigate the risk of the uncertainties that happens. And we see this is a promising way to actually be implemented in terms of ensuring we have a secure energy supply. So just to give a quick motivating example for the real options, we consider a battery storage factory that's having a revenue of $10 million per year. Next year, the prices can go up or down by 30%. And we assume that after that change in price, the prices will be fixed, and we assume a discount rate of 10%. So essentially, you have two options. The real world is more complicated, but for now, we just take these two simple options. The price will go up, and then you'll have a $13 million revenue or $7 million, and it'll continue for the rest of the future. So the cost of the building a factory is 90 millions. The question is it a good investment? So this can be answered using the net present value. You assume that the project has a capital cost in the beginning, and you see how much you'll get in return. If it's a positive value, then it's a good to go project, and you can actually invest in that. The second question is it better to wait 1 year and then invest when you see the price is settling, and then you decide whether to invest or not? And actually, in this case, you'll see that yes, the net present value of actually waiting 1 year and you eliminate the risk of the price changes will have a higher value than NPV. And of course, that's not the case of a free hot launch. There is also a premium of giving this flexibility. So there's the premium of waiting and to invest instead of investing right now. So we take this analogy to the real options where we actually change the system as needed, and we'll take a design action if a particular criteria is realized. So this criteria is not a financial metric, but essentially something from the model itself that allows us to change how the system is being built or designed as uncertainty unfolds. And you can see here we have a scenario-dependent stochastic model where the scenario realized at time equal 3 will depend on what happens before. So this is where we see we can enable an option or an exercises given the realization of one scenario or the other. So To give some of the results of the case study we're doing on power system planning. So essentially, we're trying to model the transmission planning with storage. So see the value of adding storage as a replacement or a complementary to enable adding more transmission lines to meet the increased demand. So this is a small test system of 6 bus with 9 lines, multi-period investment, meaning that we're able to take investment every single year, and we take a 10 years planning period. And in this case, we just assume a stochastic load growth, so essentially 3 levels of load growth throughout the year. And we can see here, this is the basic model, just stochastic, your regular stochastic model with handling all the uncertainties and planning for the optimal case of that. So we can see without the storage, there's a lot of curtailment in wind, especially when you have a low net load. So essentially, you have a lot of generation from variable resources, but due to the minimum generation of dispatchable units, you have to curtail all of these resources. And we see here on the right, the different investment in transmission line throughout the year. We add for a lot of investments in the first year, and then it's spread throughout the rest of the period. So next is this is the main stochastic model with the real options implemented. So there was a lot to unpack here. So we'll begin by the top right, seeing the different investment plan. And we can see here in the 5th and 9th year, we actually add a new lines based on the criteria that happen. So the criteria that we chose on the left, which is just the utilization of the lines. So essentially we measure across different scenarios how the line flow will change. And if in any scenario, this threshold is being exceeded, as we see in year 2, then the line will be exercised. And because we account for the time period between actually taking the decision to build the line and becoming operational, so this is 3 years between taking the decision in the 2nd year and being actually operational in the 5th year. And okay, so and last but not least, we'll just show the storage, how it's being able to charge, so it reduced the curtailed energy from the wind, which adding to the operational flexibility. To analyze the remaining results, we'll just take a look at the system flexibility values, essentially how much we can save from this. And going very quickly, we'll see that for the second scenario, we have almost 20% saving across the different costs of the total system. So the main takeaways is the transition to net zero energy requires different approaches to mitigate the risks. And as we saw, the real options can be a valuable method to leverage the uncertainty to achieve the pillars of secure energy transition. With that, thank you so much.
Thank you, Abdel Rahman. And now our third speaker is Francis Bradley from the Canadian Electricity Association.
Electricity Canada, yes, we changed the name, yeah. Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you for the opportunity to join you today. It is, okay, it's on here, it's not there. It's just, it will come. I always wonder about these things. I remember my grandmother, she had a TV when she first got a TV with a remote control. She would always go up and change the channel manually because she was afraid she'd hit the cat or the lamp or something. So, listen, my contribution to this discussion is structured like a hockey game. So there are 3 periods, or as the great Roger Doucette might have said back in the days in the Montreal Forum, il y a 3 périodes dans cette partie de hockey. So the first period talks about the supply chain issues and how it specifically affects the electricity sector. The second period discusses modeling risks, and the third period discusses modeling as an enabler. And I can assure you, with Mark here as the referee, I will not go into sudden death overtime. So first, let's talk about supply chain issues as they specifically affect the electricity sector. And there's no better way to illustrate that than with this, the humble utility pole. These can be found everywhere in Canada. It carries electricity across distances, and it is, and you must pardon the pun, the utility player of the distribution of electricity. They're grown from pine in new growth forests, and they last for 30 years. So why do I mention utility poles? Well, It's because where we are right now in Ottawa. Ottawa and the surrounding area had 3,000 utility poles destroyed because of the derecho that blew through here in June 2022. This year, in Canada, over 3,000 poles have been destroyed, mostly due to wildfires. All of these poles need to be replaced, in addition to the poles that are scheduled to be replaced as they reach the end of their useful life, which is why every electricity provider stockpiles thousands of these poles. But with extreme weather, we're going through utility poles far faster than we have ever before. Now let's move further up the equipment food chain to a transformer. These take years to procure. There was a time when the delays for this sort of equipment was measured in weeks and then in months, and now we're measuring it in years. What keeps every electricity CEO in Canada awake at night is that one day they'll need a transformer, and it's on a container ship in the Suez Canal, 8,919 kilometers away from Churchill, Manitoba, where it is urgently needed. And it's not just transformers, right? It's bucket trucks, it's rebar, it's cable. Electricity providers are reliant on heavy duty technology and equipment that keeps getting used up and keeps getting destroyed by extreme weather, and it takes forever to get. But that's not the only thing that keeps Canadian electricity CEOs awake at night. It's also that Canada is competing for the same resources and the same people and the same equipment as, for example, the United States, thanks to the massive investments from the Inflation Reduction Act, and multiple other countries that are all going through the same sorts of transitions that we are. So, which, can keep those transformers stuck in the Suez Canal even longer. So, which brings us back to that humble utility pole once more, because in Canada, like many places, we have supply chain crises that are also self-inflicted. We're scoring on our own net. Last year, a Canadian government agency banned electricity poles that were treated with a pesticide called pentachlorophenol. And this ban included the existing stocks that were held by companies. So it took intensive lobbying of the entire electricity industry to delay that phase out of that those particular poles. And we still don't yet have a replacement pesticide to treat poles for the future. So, there's no one-size-fits-all solution to supply chain problems. But here are some of the things that we can try. We can shorten the supply chain within North America. For example, the EV assembly plant that built my car in Chattanooga, Tennessee, is dependent on batteries from overseas, which contributed to the more than 18-month wait for the delivery of my EV. But an EV battery mega factory is now going to be coming to St. Thomas, Ontario. Another one, il va venir à Saint-Basile-le-Grand à Québec bientôt aussi, and hopefully that'll speed up the process. We need to consider geopolitics when it comes to critical minerals, and we've talked a fair amount about critical minerals. Canada is currently working on a critical mineral strategy that will look to sourcing more in Canada. We need to diversify so that we are not dependent on shifting global geopolitics. We need to invest more in building the supply chain ecosystem so that we're not at the mercy again that a boat drifts sideways into the Suez Canal and blocks up traffic. To that end, we need an open ports, open borders initiative globally to make our supply chains more robust and efficient. And we need to utilize our trade agreements better and more effectively. Now, that brings me to the end of the first period. Now, the second period. I want to talk a little bit about modeling risks and how this affects the electricity sector. So I was particularly engaged by that last panel, those 6 presentations on the clean electricity regulations. Electricity Canada's members, we've undertaken detailed region-specific projections of the impact of the CERs, and they contrast, in some cases, quite sharply with ECCC's nationally averaged modeling. This suggests a discrepancy that I think undermines the reliability of projected outcomes, and that is worrying since those national models are used to design a national policy. And we will need to start making decisions to drive a $1.7 trillion energy transition from this policy. That is a huge bet to be making if the models we base the decision-making on are off. So let's talk about the CER modeling. The model used by ECCC is designed to look at the impacts of the CERs across the country, but it generalizes the benefits and impacts across all of Canada. You know, Canada has a clean grid overall, 84% currently non-emitting, but the average hides parts of the country which are much harder to decarbonize than others. And we saw some of the charts in the last presentation. This narrowed it down and zeroed in on some of those. The result is that modeling that belies the fact that the proposed regulations will have a disproportionate impact on certain provinces. The electricity sector is concerned that the modeling that's been done significantly underestimates the expected cost of the CERs, and in fact, it hides significant localized cost impacts with these national averages. Now, here's the thing. The models used by system operators and utilities for planning purposes are highly detailed, region-dependent, and reflect their real constraints. All of these things ensure that the safety and reliability of provincial grids. Individual Electricity Canada members have specific and granular systems and granular models that can predict localized impacts, and they bring a standard of rigor and specificity that's needed for detailed system planning. The level of granularity is exactly what's needed to determine the region-specific impacts of the CERs. It's not just about abstract impacts. This has real implications for whether or not the policy is even achievable. And it's missing, I think, from this modeling. Our biggest concern is that the RIAS modeling is too optimistic when measuring reliability impacts. In real-life situations, system operators and utilities plan for worst-case scenarios. The reason for that's simple. It's to make sure that there's always enough power to support safety and reliability for all Canadians. This is why we're alarmed to note that Electricity Canada and its members have not been able to replicate ECCC's modeling results of the potential cost impacts of implementing the CERs at a provincial level. This suggests that ECCC's RIAS modeling is based on overly optimistic scenarios, and as a result, they've underestimated the costs associated with preserving safety and reliability. Without actual coordination and cooperation from the neighboring provinces and the federal governments, key assumptions about transmission interties may not materialize. For example, the modeling assumed the Atlantic Loop would be completed, but the project has now been significantly scaled back. Also, the RIAS does not factor in additional infrastructure costs, such as added grid support, so ancillary services costs based on, for increasing renewables, and other added costs beyond generation, for example, increasing transmission costs. The underestimates overall associated with the implementation, we think, of the CERs. Which brings me to taking a look at the clock, a shortened third period. So let's talk about modeling as an enabler. And I'm going to name 3 traits that I think good modeling should reflect. I'm standing in a room of modelers with no modeling experience, and I'm gonna go forward anyway. All right. So first of all, modeling needs to be transparent. We learned from the CERs that we need a full understanding of all of the economic modeling being used so that we can run the numbers and come up with something similar. The considerable gap between the expert industry modeling and that of the federal government raises red flags for us. It's critical that we understand the inputs and the outputs of the model, especially provincial level outcomes that directly affect electricity providers. And industries are a source here and a resource. The people that are actually building these things can help modelers understand where they are on track and where they need improvement. Secondly, modeling needs to be regional. As I said earlier, the problem electricity providers found again and again with ECCC's RIAS modeling is that they dwelled on the national average and, for example, they didn't look at the impacts in regions that will depend on fossil fuel-based power generation for the foreseeable future. This is a big, diverse country. Exactly nowhere is average, so don't model nowhere. And lastly, Modeling is an evolving thing. I think everybody here fully understands that the model is used for any kind of modeling evolves as the real world circumstances change as well. To go back to the supply chain issue I discussed a couple of minutes ago, nobody knew how to spell the word derecho 2 years ago. Now we do. The models being used for designing the CERs will change as ECCC collects feedback and new circumstances emerge. All we ask is that we be kept informed about these changes to the model and that we understand how the inputs and the outputs have changed. So I want to end as I began with the utility pole. These poles bring power into people's homes. They help with heating, with feeding, with cleaning, with keeping us connected, and so much more. When they're gone, everybody notices. You can ask any number of Electricity Canada's employees back in 2022, when some of them were without power for 10 days as a result of that derecho. We know this and we prepare for this. On the supply chain side, we can see the challenges we face keeping those utility poles in stock. On the modeling side, electricity providers are aware of the challenges we face getting electricity generated so that it can be distributed through utility poles like this one. That's why it's important for governments to be in dialogue with electricity providers and for their modeling to reflect the work of companies whose job it is to make sure customers get electricity, that they get it safely, they get it reliably, and they get it affordably. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Francis. I'm assuming we've got 15 minutes. Okay, and so there will be some questions perhaps appearing online. As usual, Normand will be at the microphone, and I have some questions as well. And I want to also try to share the load along the group here, so I'll try to play that role as well. So Normand, please go ahead. Premièrement.
Yes, for Francis. We didn't see any data. I mean, you tell us you did modeling. We were presenting this morning data and results from models. I mean, we cannot believe you unless we have the data and the modeling results from your associations. Then we can say, are you doing it right or not? Do we agree or not? So will you share all the modeling that you've done with data and all the assumptions that we can look at this and compare with what we shared this morning?
Yep. Thank you for the question. What we have is modeling done by a couple of dozen companies. So we absolutely. Well, listen, there's a couple of those companies that are actually in this room, and I know increasingly some of them are becoming involved in this. The results and that modeling is indeed being fed back into ECCC and into the consultation process, specifically on the CERs. So that is certainly taking place at the association level. We're not modelers. I feel a little bit like Evan on the last panel. The odd man out on this panel. But our members are actively engaging certainly the community and are participating increasingly in the community and providing what we have in terms of results with the government and through the consultation on the CERs.
And I might pile on just a little bit here, just because this was right where I was going to ask as well, Francis, just that I don't know who gets to be in non-disclosure agreements or whatever, but at some point I've seen some of I had seen early on some of the RIAS modeling, and I did see it broken down regionally. And that's what we focused on. So I'm not quite sure why you say it was not broken down, but perhaps I'm not privy to what the final product was. And I was wondering, though, because I also saw work that's as one and have colleagues in Alberta who have done this, like Schaefer, others, as you relax some of the things that you say were costly, what was the cost saving of relaxing those? Do you have that as well?
So the cost shaving of relaxing?
Like, let's say what we saw today, it goes from 450 hours to 1,000 hours for a standby plant use. It just turned out that very small changes could really make the clean electricity regulation a lot cheaper. So I'm wondering if you're privy to that as well.
Yeah, and
are
I know-
you seeing the same thing that I saw?
Yeah, and we're seeing it. It looks different depending upon what jurisdiction you're in, what province you're in.
Yeah.
And that information is being fed back on an individual basis in terms of what people are seeing in those different jurisdictions. But yes, the same sort of thing is turning up in the work that our members are doing as well. And it isn't a great deal of a change in terms of the number of hours that results in pretty significant reductions in terms of the overall cost.
Yeah, but I guess I was just saying,
Yeah.
Great to have more numbers. I'm just curious about how much it would change, what the real cost of the policy was, and so on. But let's pass it on. Next person.
Great, thanks. So Mark Karras with Natural Resources Canada, also to Francis, and on the question of data. So my understanding is that distribution system impacts are quite challenging to model without the appropriate data sets. So is there, in dialogue with your members, utilities, is there a couple of lessons learned or thoughts that they might have on how they might share that data with modelers so that distribution level impacts are able to be represented by more independent modeling bodies? I understand there are commercial concerns, so kind of wondering if there's anything that you've heard from your members that might make that more feasible or how that could happen.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't give you much more than that there are active conversations that are taking place within the association, at our councils, and at our committees.
Thanks. I'll go to the screen here. I'm thinking this next question you might be interested in it, Mark. But I'm not sure I get it. For electric vehicles, what about the development of batteries? So we've heard this before, which is apparently carbon intensive, and the life of batteries, and an EV owner has to pay $50,000 for a new battery. I think that's what it says. I don't know. Does anybody want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, to be clear, we for the purpose of what we did was mostly looking at the back end of the supply chain as opposed to the front end, but obviously there were implications mostly in terms of supply. There's a whole bunch of complicated questions here embedded. We did not do a full life cycle on upstream on EV batteries, and indeed, at least on the critical mineral side, the biggest concerns are probably non-carbon, but one would need to look very carefully at the supply chain that's involved to figure that out. And that's actually very hard to do. Downstream, there's a whole nest of questions. I think the answer is you're probably better leasing than buying. Because among other things, that tends to mean that responsibility for the battery ends up with the OEM as opposed to with you. You also need to read whatever your sales or lease agreement says very, very carefully, particularly the mouse typing that may be at the bottom of the page, about who is responsible for the battery at end of life. These are questions we asked to people who we thought should have answers, and we didn't get any answers, quite strikingly. So this is a complicated space in terms of where are we at. Where the Europeans have gone has been much clearer, which is it's an extended producer responsibility situation that the OEM and the original equipment manufacturer takes ultimate responsibility for what happens to the battery at end of life, and there's a requirement that it be recycled or material recovered from it. So they've clarified that quite a bit relative to where we stand and provide some clarity for owners and purchasers as well. It's more complicated as you get into Second Lives. There's a whole legal line of research we got into, but I don't have time to try and unpack here. These were law students who were my co-researchers, so they were happy to go down those pathways.
Right. So thank you. And then I see a question for Abdul Rahman, but actually I don't like it. It sounds like this person can hunt you down. So maybe I'll ask something instead. You were trying to get us the value of flexibility, and you did an example on the value of delay. Have you explored other things with respect to value of flexibility that you might want to elaborate a bit?
Yeah, so actually what we did is that we modeled the system itself. So it's not an option to delay as much as to change the structure but it turns out that you can delay investment of line or actually build it before it was built in the previous scenarios. But we're looking at different technologies like FACTS and to be a rapid substitute for transmission lines. So we can install some devices that we can actually delay the investment of lines. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Je vais juste commencer par dire un grand merci à EMH d'avoir organisé les sessions de ce matin. J'ai beaucoup apprécié avoir autant de rétroactions et de modélisation qui étaient faites sur the Clean Electricity Regulations. Donc, I'm Pascal Lesage. I'm one of the modelers that worked on the models that went into feeding the Clean Electricity Regulations thinking and the parameterization of it. And I really did appreciate everything that happened this morning. I also want to say a big thank you to everyone in the room and Electricity Canada and all your members that provided comments. We have read every single one of them. We're engaging with them. We are taking all that feedback in. So that was my first point. Thank you very much. My second point is just maybe on this notion of Canadian average. So I think, Mark, you were right. We do break down in the RIAS, which doesn't actually come from the model that I work on, and the model that we work on. We do break out the impacts by province, but I think maybe what you meant, Francis, is that the optimization is done for Canada as a whole, and it's not done for every single province. So I just wanted to maybe clarify, is that what you meant? Is that we're looking for a Canadian optimal and not looking at every single province one at a time and seeing what its optimal is? And if that is what you meant, I was wondering maybe, are there other solutions? Like what have other people done when we're looking at federal regulations? Have they looked at every single province one at a time? Or did they look at the Canadian optimal, or did they do both? So we're in the process of doing both, but I was just opening up the floor to that question.
Yeah, no, and thank you for that. Thank you for clarifying what I was trying to say. But yeah, I mean, the challenge, of course, is the huge difference between the different regions in the country, and how can you construct. And I sympathize with the people that are trying to put together the regulation. How do you construct a regulation that will be effective in 13 different jurisdictions in the country that are so incredibly different? Where, you know, for example, in Quebec, it isn't a particularly challenging issue, frankly. The clean electricity regulations, the comments that we put together as an association on the CERs, there was a little asterisk on the front page that said, you know, Hydro-Quebec is taking a different path because they're able to do this. But like, how do you construct a national set of regulations that can apply equally to a jurisdiction that has no problem with meeting that versus a jurisdiction that has no options for? I know we saw a number of charts this morning that showed, for example, Alberta and Ontario and Nova Scotia that were broken out. I would have liked to have seen more charts of Saskatchewan. I'd like to, you know, if you want to kind of pinpoint what the sort of the polar opposites are potentially in terms of the challenge of meeting the CERs in the country. Yes, it's certainly challenging in Alberta. I would suggest that it may be even more challenging in Saskatchewan in terms of other options. So that's the challenge that I see is how do you construct something at a national level without any regional flexibility when there are so incredibly massive differences from region to region.
And as the moderator, I'm not supposed to cut in here, but just say that all I ever looked at was impacts in Saskatchewan and Alberta, like whether it was the government doing it or any other groups of modelers. So I come away from the last 2 years with that kind of perspective. Also, when people said, what will be, the first time I heard 2035 or whatever deadline it was, the point was, oh, but you could have 2025 for British Columbia, Quebec, because this is what the government's there, which is a cost for us. And then, so I was told, why 2035? Because we're trying to make a regulation that's sensitive to different costs for different regions. So it seemed a bit ironic to me that we would talk about this as if it wasn't regionally sensitive. The timelines certainly reflect that, but I shouldn't be doing that. I'm the moderator. So I'm going to have one more question here, if I can, for Mark. And I liked your comment about avoid carbon tunnel vision. And But I'll challenge you, and I know you're going to be able to come back strong, is that us academics are always listing all of the elements that need to be taken into account, or the extra feedbacks and complexities. But whenever I've been involved in the policy world, I sort of say to myself, yeah, but that's not the real world. It's a very imperfect world. And if I'm in a meeting with 3 cabinet ministers, and I'm just trying to get them to remember that there's got to be a regulation or a price, and it's got to rise in stringency. And then someone comes in and says, but maybe we can change behavior. That it ends up being, oh, you know what? Let's go do that other easy stuff. So I actually prefer carbon tunnel vision, because I think without it, we don't get anywhere.
The problem is that it puts us into precisely this risk of very significant trade-offs in a larger sustainability context. That you can't save the planet by destroying it at the same time, to put it bluntly. I mean, that's the real dilemma at that scale. I mean, on the critical mineral side, for example, I haven't done mining stuff for 20 years, but even then, you know, we had folks saying, look, the existing levels of extractive activity are beyond sustainable, what the global biosphere can sustain. And then we have the IEA coming on and say, well, you got to increase production of certain minerals by factors of order of magnitude or more. That's going to raise some pretty serious questions. In a Canadian context, and I see there's questions about decolonization as well, which you know, is another layer to this whole conversation, which we haven't really cracked here, but in which there's both moral dimensions, but also legal dimensions too, in relation to both duty to consult and UNDRIP, which have to be taken into account in these decisions. I mean, what the real message is to recognize complexity, recognize when you're making trade-offs. Think about, is there another way we could do this that avoids the trade-off, that gets us to where we want to be, but reduces those kinds of risks? I mean, that would be my basic answer. I mean, we're very clear, you know, decarbonization is an essential component of sustainability. The trick is not to sacrifice other dimensions of sustainability in the process.
Thank you. Well said. Okay, I know we're out of time, and I guess it's lunchtime now. And so I want to please join me in thanking our panel. And we'll stay here while Edouard, please come up.